pray for these folks tonight, but all through the week and the days ahead, let's remember them. And then along with those other prayers, don't forget our youth tonight down at the Bible camp. Be praying for Stephen and all the adult workers. I know they're having a special night tonight. They're doing some things they do about once a year that's always special with the kids. So you pray for them and for good wisdom and guidance there as they lead that program. And then for those that are working back in the fellowship hall with the younger kids, you pray for them. I think you're going to be glad that you're here tonight if you've been with us through this book, the study of the book of Job. I think tonight especially, we're going to all see some things, I hope, that will be a blessing, a help, and encouragement to us. And here's why. We're coming tonight at long last, and as I've been saying for the last several weeks, we're skipping now because there's so much. Once you get into the meat of the book of Job, there's a lot of repetition with Job's friends offering the same criticism over and over and over, and Job trying to defend himself and wondering, why God's abandoning him and wishing he could just find God so we could talk to him about it. And then as we talked about last week, suddenly out of nowhere, kind of when Job's three friends and Job's, after talking for hours, they eventually ran out of gas, and that always happens. Now, some people, it takes them longer than others to run out of verbal gas. Have you ever noticed that? Some people can go for a long time before they take a breath. In fact, I've been with people sometimes, and that's what you're waiting on. You're waiting for them to take a breath just so you can jump into the conversation. Well, they all kind of eventually wore themselves out, and they've said all they can think of to say, and they get very silent. And then this guy that we didn't even know he was there, we didn't even know he was sitting there listening to all this young guy named Elihu jumps into the situation, and he says, now I've been patiently waiting. Mama raised me to respect my elders, and you guys are older and I'm younger, so I let you say all that you had to say, but I got to tell you what I think now. And he goes on for about 3 or 4 chapters, and his basic criticism is directed at both Job's friends and at Job. He doesn't leave any of them out. To Job's friends, he says, you know what? You haven't made a case at all. You condemn Job for being wicked, yet you offer no proof that he actually is. You condemn Job for being a hypocrite, a liar, a secret sinner, but you have no evidence to suggest that any of that's true, but you condemn him anyway. I always thought, well, that means they'd make a good Baptist. Whatever the evidence, let's just condemn them. Let's just jump on them and pound them. And, as we often say, the church is some of the world's worst at shooting our own soldiers. And that's what these guys are doing. Even Job kept saying that. You guys are miserable comforters. You're physicians of no value. He said, you're not helping. But then he turns to Job and he jumps on Job as well. And he says, listen, Job, your friends haven't been able to prove a case against you, but you're saying some things that are wrong too. You're making it out like that God has abandoned you and God has forgotten you, and if you could just argue with God, you could straighten all this out and you could reason with God. And he says, and that's wrong too. And then we come to this pivotal moment tonight when after Elihu runs out of gas, all of a sudden God begins to speak. Now this is what's interesting, is that after all this time, God suddenly shows up and he begins to talk. Now, as I mentioned last week, and we'll probably talk about this at some point, maybe next week, God gets on Job's 3 friends, he calls them out, and he gets on Job. The only person God doesn't speak to at all is Elihu. Now, as we talked about last week, 2 schools of thought on that. Some people say, well, what that guy said was so unimportant that God ignores him. And you can make that case. The thing that kind of argues against that is if what he said was so unimportant, why did God allow him to put 4 chapters worth of talking in Scripture? That kind of leans toward the other direction. And the other direction is that God didn't get on Elihu because God is like, what that guy said is pretty on target. What he said to Job's friends and what he said to Job. And based on what God says, he seems to have been on the right track. Now, here's what I've always thought was so interesting about the book of Job when you get to this moment. All my life, growing up a preacher's kid and growing up in church, reading books, different things, even in Schofield's notes, everywhere, people always say, Job is the book that answers the question, why do good people suffer? They say, hey, if you want to know why good people suffer, read the book of Job. You want me to tell you something? The book of Job does not answer that question. The book of Job makes it clear good people do suffer. But it doesn't give the reason why. Because there are multitudes of reasons why things like that can happen. But here's what I want you to notice. God is about to start speaking. And God is going to talk about a host of subjects. You know the one topic God never even addresses? God never even talks about? Why Job is suffering. Never even mentions it. God isn't discussing that. That's not what God is there to talk about. So if you think, or if you've always heard, well, Job, the book of Job answers the question, why good people suffer, I don't know about that, because when God finally shows up and gives this long discourse, nowhere does he address why Job was suffering or why good people suffer. As I said, good people suffer for a multitude of reasons. And God is about to say some things, and the way we're going to come at it tonight, we're going to look at it in three different ways. Now, when you get to this section, and again, we're hitting highlights at this point. When you get to this section about where God is talking, you can go a lot of different directions, and I have down through the years. We've talked about Leviathan, and we've talked about all these strange things that God talks about, and we've discussed all that at great length. That's not where I want to go tonight. Where I want to go tonight is something much more, what I hope will be much more practical, because I want you to see what God does here. Notice with me, chapter 38, Job has spoke, his three friends have spoke, they've talked all day long, they finally run out of gas, then Elihu speaks for several chapters, then he runs out of gas, and finally, after all this debate, after all these accusations, after everybody saying, I think this and I think that, finally, God shows up. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Now that's King James prose, and it's beautiful. But you know what God basically just said? There's a bunch of people talking that don't know what they're talking about. There's a lot of people talking that have no knowledge. Now, I don't know if you realize it, but there's still a lot of that going on in the world today. Just look on social media. You'll see plenty of it. People talking, people that darken counsel without knowledge. And there's a lot of that going on. God says, hey, you know what? All of you people are talking, and none of you seem to know what you're talking about. God says, gird up now thy loins like a man. Now again, wonderful, beautiful King James prose. You know what God is basically saying? Pull your pants up and be a man, because I'm about to take you to task. God is saying, get ready. For I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Have you ever had a pop quiz? Think about some of the hardest teachers you ever had. Think about a pop quiz and you're going, oh no, I know they're going to ask me some questions I don't know. How would you like to get a pop quiz from God? Because that's basically what's happening here. God shows up. You know what Job's three friends are thinking when God shows up? Yeah, God's going to finally tell old Job, we were right. He's a secret sinner. God's going to expose him. You know what Job is thinking? God's going to finally explain to me why I'm going through what I'm going through. God says, no. Here's that great moment where God says, I didn't come to do all that. I came to take over the conversation. I came to address what I want to address. And God says, I'm about to ask you a bunch of questions, and I want you to answer. I know some of you have heard me tell this before, but this is one of those memories that as long as I live, I'll never forget this. I've been down through the years, going through a lot of higher education classes. I've sat under a lot of teachers, and some of them very intimidating, some of them not so much. But when I finished my master's degree at Jacksonville and went to Auburn in the doctoral program, everybody told me, including the people at Auburn, that, this is going to be a different world. It's going to be kind of culture shock. That, we know you did this at JSU, but it gets a little more intense when you get to this level. One of the first classes that I ever took was 18th century English history. And it was a seminar. All these classes were seminar classes where there's about 20 of us all in the same program. And we all sit around these long tables, and the professor sits at the head of the table. It's not like he stands up and lectures and all that. It's a very different environment. I'd never been through anything like that. And I'll never forget this. The guy that was teaching that class was a man named Dr. Robert Ray. I'll always remember Dr. Ray. Several reasons. I'll always remember Dr. Ray because he was the smartest man by far that I ever met. It's in terms of scholastic knowledge, smartest man I ever met, genius. He was the head of the history department at Auburn during the time that I was there. He was an older man. I'll never forget him for this reason as well, and this was in like 90, so technology was still nowhere near what it is now. But even in 1990, Dr. Ray was one of the most anti-technological guys you'd ever come across. He did not, this is how anti-technology he was. Now this is 1990. Most people are working on computers and doing all their printing and tests and all that. Dr. Ray still had a manual typewriter that he did all of his manuscripts, all of his tests, all the books he wrote, all of it on a manual typewriter. Very old-fashioned. I always remember that about him. And then I remember that he was the guy that when I went to Auburn the very first time to get interviewed, to get accepted in the program, he was the guy that interviewed. He became the head of my committee. And he was the one that brought me into this program. But the main reason I'll never forget him, and this will always stay with me, is when my dad got sick and we realized what was happening with my dad, that he was going to die. And I went in to leave Auburn. And the plan was, back then, because I was so close to the finish line, I went in and I sat down with Dr. Ray. You know, and back then I was a lot younger, but he was very old even then, but just brilliant. And I'd never talked to him about personal stuff before. And I explained to him the situation and that I needed to withdraw from school. And I told him, I said, this is just temporary. I'm going to withdraw. I want to see if I can just get incompletes in these classes. And I've got to go home and be with my mom and be with my dad and deal with the situation at the church. And one of these days here real soon, I'm going to come back and finish all this up. I'll never forget what he told me. He looked at me and he said, Daniel, he said, you go home and do what you need to do. He said, but I want to tell you something. You'll never be back. And I said, what do you mean? He said, son, I've seen situations like this before. He said, and this isn't a criticism. You need to go home and deal with your family and be there for your congregation. But here's what's going to happen. Your life is about to get really, really, really busy. And I doubt if you'll ever find the time to come back and finish this. You know what? He was a prophet. I never did. That's the last time I ever talked to him. Never saw him again. But he was just such a, in person like that, he was so generous. But let me come back to where this class was. I'd never had him as an instructor. He was the most intimidating instructor I ever had. He walks in that first day. We're all, about 20 of us, guys and girls as well. We're sitting around this table. We all think we're pretty smart, okay? We're in a doctoral program. He walked in and sat down and he said, ladies and gentlemen, my job is not to convince you how smart you are. My job is to convince you how stupid you are. And then he set about to do it. And here's what he did. Here's how he would start every class. For the first 10, 12 minutes of every class, he would fire off questions about 18th century British politics. And there was nothing about it he didn't know. The first time, the very first day he did it, and he would just go around there, and he already knew all our names. There was no hiding. He would just randomly call people out and ask a question. That first day, he would ask questions. Everybody there, Dr. Ray, I don't know. Dr. Ray, I don't know. Dr. Ray, I don't know. When he finished with that, he said, now, we're going to move on into the class. He said, but I want to tell you something. He said, it's okay that you didn't have any answers today. He said, but starting next class, you better have answers. Do you think that wasn't intimidating? I mean, every class I'd go in there, my blood pressure would go out of sight those first 15 minutes. And you know what? When you're 6'4" and my size, it's kind of hard to hide behind anybody. I'm trying, but you know, there's just no way to do it. And but those questions he would ask would just blow my mind. Well, I said all that to say this. That's nothing compared to what God's about to do. God is about to give the ultimate pop quiz to everybody involved. He says, I will demand, I'll ask the questions, you give the answers. Now, I love that about God. There's no debating this. Yeah, you don't get to ask anything. I'm asking the questions, You give the answers. Now watch what God does. God is going to point out to Job and his friends 3 key things. Now watch this in this chapter. He's going to point out he created things Job could never create, or neither could any of Job's friends, or neither could any of us. God is saying, you know what? I am a creator God. What I've done, you could never do. And then he talks about it. Listen to this. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. He looks at Job and his friends and he says, where were you guys when I created all this? Where were you at? Were you here? Did you see any of it? Were you witnesses? Were you a part of? Did you help me do any of this? You guys seem to be awfully smart. Did I need your help when I was creating this universe? And then God goes into more detail. He says, who hath laid the measure thereof? If thou knowest, he says, tell me, if you know anything about how all this was laid out, tell me. Who has stretched the line upon it? Whereupon, I love this question, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Now think about that one for a second. Now Job and his friends, they didn't know this because they lived a long, long, long time ago. But here's the question God is asking. What holds the earth up? What holds it up? For a long time, ancient men, they believed that there was some God. Have you ever seen the picture of the kneeling God and the earth sitting on his shoulders or on his back? And they thought that's what holds the earth in place. You know what God is saying? You have no idea. You have no idea what holds the earth in place. He says, who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. God is saying, where were you guys when I made all this? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as it issued out of the womb? Here's a great discussion right here. God is asking about the oceans. Now remember, these guys haven't seen the whole earth. They don't even know how big God's creation is. We do. We have an even better perspective now than they did then because they only had a very limited worldview. But God says, think about the ocean. He said, when I made a cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness the swaddling band for it, and I break up for it my decreed place and set bars and doors. In other words, God says, you know what? When I created the ocean, I created specific places for the ocean to go. God said, I put limits on it. I love this next verse for a lot of reasons, but I love this verse. And he says, and God said, I said to the ocean, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. God said, where were you guys when I was doing all that? You guys seem to know so much. Where were you when I told the ocean, when I told the proud waves of the ocean, you can come this far, but no further? God is saying, I created all this. Now, you know what we know from the book of Genesis? You know what we know from the story of creation? That we know that God made everything. The Latin phrase is ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. It's not that God took a bunch of goo and turned it into something. It's much bigger than that. It's the idea that God spake everything into existence out of nothing. You've heard me say this 1,000 times. The reason people have such a problem with the miracles in the Bible is not that the miracles are too big, but it's because their God is too small. If you ever wrap your mind around the God of creation, a God who spoke the words and everything came into existence, a God who the Bible says as an afterthought, after all that God made, as an afterthought, the Bible says, oh, and he made the stars also. Just threw them into place. And God is telling Job and his friends, when I was doing all that, when I was putting everything exactly where it was supposed to go, when I was putting limitations on the ocean and the waves and every part of creation, where were you guys? What were you doing when I was doing all that creating? Were you there? Were you a part of it? So the first thing God talks about is this idea of creation. He says, hast thou commanded the morning since thy days and caused the day spring to know its place? God says, do you guys know anything about this creation deal? Were you a part of all that? So the first thing God says is, hey, I created things that you could never create. I've done things you could never replicate. But But then God says this. He comes to the next part of this chapter and he says, not only did I create things you couldn't create, God says, I know things that you don't know. Now, you know what? In our head, we all are, and it's almost funny because you hear sometimes people say, well, I know I'm not as smart as God. Whenever I hear somebody say it, you know what I want to say? Really? You know that? I'm glad you know that. Was there a question about that? Did somebody think you were as smart as God? But in our head, we all go, I know I'm not as smart as God. But you know what? Sometimes in the way we live, we kind of give off the impression we do know as much as God. Isn't that what everybody in this story has been doing? Thinking that they knew the mind of God? Isn't that what Job's three friends have been doing? They've been saying, we know why God is doing this. We know what God is up to. We know why God is punishing you. We know why God is putting you through this. Everybody in the story has been saying, they've been speaking for God. They've been saying, we know the mind of God. This is why you've heard me say so many times, whenever somebody tells me, God told me to tell you, that always makes me nervous because people are saying, I know what God knows. Can I tell you something tonight? I don't know what God knows. I will never know what God knows. None of us will ever know what God knows. And God is about to prove that to Job and his friends, that he knows things they don't know. Listen to what he says. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? Or hast thou walked in search of the depth? In other words, God is saying, hey, Job, do you know how deep the ocean is? At its deepest point, do you know how deep the ocean is, Job? Because I do. I do. Now, you know how deep Job and his friends probably thought the ocean was? Well, it's over my head. If I go out there far enough, it's over my head. And that's about as all. God says, I can tell you how deep it is. Pick a place. Pick any place. I tell you exactly what the depth of the ocean is because God says, I know that. I know all about my creation. He says, have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Here's a great question for all of mankind. God says, what do you know about death, Job? Do you know what happens when you die? I do. Do you know what processes you go through when death comes for you? God says, I know. I know exactly what happens. Do you guys know it? God, I can just see God looking at it just, hey guys, do y'all know what happens when you die? Not exactly. I do. I know all of that. God says, I know the depths of the ocean. I know what happens when death comes. God says, hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. I love the way God says, if you know everything, tell me. Here's a simple question. God says, how big around is the earth? Do you guys know that? You seem to know a lot. You seem to think you know everything. Just answer some basic questions. How big around is the earth? And they're like, we have no idea, God. You know what God says? I know. I know. God has no doubt about it. God knows exactly how big the earth is. Look a little further. God says, where is the way where light? Here's a great question. This is so simple, but it's so brilliant. God says, where does light dwell? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? In other words, in simple English, here's what God says. When you turn the lights off, or when you turn the lights on, when the lights come on, when the sun comes, where does the darkness go? Where does it go? Where does the light come from? God is just asking these very basic questions of these guys, but God is making the same point with them that Dr. Hay made with us all those years ago. You don't know everything. There is much more that you don't know than you do know. And God is pointing out to these guys, I know so much more than you guys know. There is so much you don't understand. There is so much you don't perceive. And God is saying, you need to understand that I know some things you don't know. And then God gets a little sarcastic. He says, knowest thou it because thou was then born? He says, oh, you guys seem to know it. I know how you know all that because you were around, right? Back when I did all this, you were there, right? He says, because you were born back then, or because the number of thy days is great. Have you ever, and I guess this is a sign of getting old, But does it sometimes make you mad when somebody that's not even out of their 20s yet seems to act like they know everything there is to know about life? You know, when I was young, I was that 20-year-old. You know, can you remember your dad saying, son, you're not even wet behind the ears yet. You don't know nothing, you know? Well, when you get older, you know what you realize? That's true. That's true. God, remember how respectful Elihu was of these guys because they were elderly? Well, I didn't work with God. Can you imagine one of Job's friends going, well, I'm 80-some years old. I've seen a lot. God says, 80 years old, huh? You know how long I've been around? Forever. God is making some serious points with these guys. I do things you can't do. I know things you will never know. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? God just asked all these basic questions about nature and creation and the earth and everything. And God is again making the point. Number one, He's created things that they could never create. God does things they can't do. He knows things they can't know. And then in this last section, He talks about God does things that they cannot do. Do we all realize God can do some things we can't do? There are some things that are out of our control, out of our power, out of our ability to do anything about. God's about to make that point. Listen to what He says. Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there's no man? In other words, God says, you know what I do? I make it rain anywhere I want to. How long has mankind been trying to replicate that? If you've ever watched an old Western, you've seen the rain dances, right? In fact, as dry as it's been, you may have tried a few here in the last couple of weeks. Everybody's yard's drying up and blowing away. You know what we still can't do? We can't make it rain. Can't do it. You know what God said? I'd make it rain anywhere I want, anytime I want. I can make it lightning. I can make it thunder. God says to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, kind of sounds like us right now, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth. God is saying, anywhere I see that I want it to rain, I can make it rain. Can you guys do that? God looks at Job and his buddies and He says, this is a simple thing. This isn't a big one. This is a simple one. Can you make it rain anytime, anywhere you want it to rain? God says, I can. I can do that. And then He goes on. Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? That's a rhetorical question. You know what God is saying? Who's the father of the rain? God is. God says, I control that. I decide when it rains, where it rains, how long it rains. God says, that's up to me. I do that. I control that. And He goes on. Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? God is asking, where did all that come from? You know what He's saying? I did that. God says, when you see that ice, when you see that frost on the ground, God says, I did that. That's something I do. I have control over all of that. The waters are hid with a stone. The face of the deep is frozen. And then He asks, boy, this gets deep right here. He looks at him and He says, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? God says, I want you guys to look up into the sky. Now, they weren't familiar. The only stars they knew about were the ones they could see with the naked eye. And if I'm remembering right, there's about 300 or so stars that you can see with the naked eye. Add a telescope, a powerful one, and you know what you find out? They're innumerable. But God points out some that even they knew about. Some constellations that they were already aware of, Orion and Pleiades. And He says, can you control those? Can you make those stars do what you want them to do? Because you know what God is saying? I can. I have absolutely. He says, canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? God says, can you get the stars to move in the way that you want them to move? If we were talking in modern day language, again, God would say, can you change the orbits of the stars and the constellations and all of these parts of the vastness? God says, can you change any of that? Because you know what he says? I can. God is saying, I have absolute control over my creation. I created it, I know about it, and I can do anything with it that I choose to do. He says, here's the rain one. Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? You know what God just said? Again, can you make it rain? I can. I can. I make it rain anytime I want to, anywhere I want to. Canst thou send lightning, that they may go and say unto thee, here we are? God says, can you control the lightning? Can you make the lightning strike wherever you want it to strike? Can you tell it to stop if you want it to stop? By the way, what does these verses right here play right into? You remember that night on the Sea of Galilee in the midst of that horrible storm? When it was storming and the waves were crashing and the thunder was booming and the lightning was striking everywhere? And Jesus walked out on the deck of the ship and he looked up to the sky and he said, be quiet. And the thunder and the lightning and the rain stopped. And he looked down at the waves and he said, be still. And every wave died. And you remember what they said about the disciples? I've always loved this. When they woke Jesus up about the storm, remember it said they were scared? They said, Master, don't you care that we're about to die? But after Jesus stilled the storm, you know what the Bible says? They were even more afraid. Because they asked this question, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? You know who he is? He's God. The same God that looked at Job and said, I can make it rain, I can make it storm, I control the lightning, I control the thunder, I move the planets, the stars, anything I want to do, I can do. God is saying there is nothing I can't do. By the way, it's comforting to know that's true. Do you know that question was asked in the Old Testament? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? Aren't you glad the answer came later? There is nothing too hard for the Lord. There's nothing God can't do. And that's the point God is making. He says, who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? Who hath given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds in wisdom? Who can stay the bottles of heaven? When the dust groweth into hardness and the clods cleave fast together, wilt thou hunt the prey of the lion or fill the appetite for them? In other words, God is asking, he's saying, who provides food for all these animals? Who makes sure that all of my creation has what they need to survive? When they crouch in their dens and abide in the covert to lay in wait, who provided for the raven his food? When his young ones cry unto God, they wonder for lack of meat. God says, I take care of all that. Again, did Jesus not echo those words later in the New Testament when he was talking about us worrying, which we all do way too much? And he said, why do you worry so much? He said, God takes care of the birds, God takes care of the grass, God takes care of the flowers. How much more does he love you? God is making a point to Job and his friends. There are things I've created you can't create. There are things I know you will never know. And there are things I can do that you can never do. Now here's why I said all that, and I want you to really focus with me for a second. Why is God saying all that? Why didn't God look down at Job and say, Job, this is why you're going through what you're going through? Because that's not the lesson he wanted Job to learn. Here's the lesson God wanted Job to learn. Watch this and we're done. God wants us to remember that he knows things we don't know. He's telling these guys, you don't know why Job is going. Job doesn't know why, and none of you guys know. I know why, God says. I know why this is going on. Then God says, I see things you don't see. There are parts of the story you don't see. Again, words that are echoed in the New Testament. When Paul says, now we see through a dark covered glass, we don't see the whole picture. He said, but one of these days when we get to heaven, God will let us see the whole thing. God is saying, I see things you don't see. I know things you don't know. And here's what God wanted Job to learn. And I think he wants all of us to learn. God wanted Job to trust him to do right. God is looking at Job and saying, Job, instead of you trying to figure out why this is happening, and Job's friends, instead of you trying to figure out why I'm allowing this to happen, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just trust me that I'm God, that I know more than you know, that I see more than you see, and that I'll take care of you. That's the lesson I think God wanted Job to learn. And that's a lesson that all of us need to learn sometimes, is that even in the darkest moments of life, you know what we can do? We can trust God. Do you remember that moment that Abraham asked God that $1 million question? When God came to visit Abraham and he said, Abraham, I'm leaving here and I'm going down to Sodom and I'm going to judge that place. You remember what Abraham asked? Will the Lord of all the earth do right? You know what God wants us to know? I will do right. You may not understand it. You may not can see it. It may not make sense to you right now, but I want you to trust that I know more than you know, that I see more than you see, and that I love you and have your best interest at heart. So trust me. That was the message to Job. And I think it's the message to all of us. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. And thank you for these folks and for their faithfulness. And God, I do pray that all of us, when the valleys come, when the uncertainty comes, when the difficult days come, that we'll remember there's a God in heaven who has created things that are so far above anything we can comprehend. That there's a God in heaven who knows so much more than any of us will ever know. That there's a God in heaven who can do anything he decides to do. Help us to trust that God. Help us to say, you know what? I don't understand it. It may not make sense to me. I can't figure it out. But I trust God. Father, I pray that we'll remember that message